سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله تبارك وتعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. Before I start, if you could just go and there's some paper, so if you would like to ask any questions, then you could just write it down on this piece of paper and then inshallah just forward it to me. After the lesson there will be a question and answer session. In the past few weeks we've been concentrating on verse number 3 of Surah Al-Baqarah, and in particular the fragment where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes one of the qualities and the characteristics of the God-fearing people, and he says وَيُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ, that the God-fearing people, one quality of them is that they establish salah, they establish their namaz with full devotion, with full concentration. And in the last few weeks or so we've been looking at some masails and some contemporary issues which have been deduced from this particular fragment. And we looked at issues such as reading namaz in different times, in different or in extreme latitudes. We also looked at other contemporary issues with regards to namaz. Now last week, one of the topics which we looked at was with regards to combining your prayers. That what does Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi say with regards to combining your prayers? What does Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayhi say with regards to combining your prayers? Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullah alayhi. So this particular masla or issue was looked at in great detail last week. Now there's one masla which I would like to touch on with regards to this particular issue. And the masla which I would like to touch on is a masla where many students who study at universities, who study at colleges, come or face with. The masla or the ruling is that those of you who study at universities or colleges, then in the winter, sometimes you may have like a 2-hour lecture. From 2 p.m. till 4 p.m. you may have a 2-hour lecture. And what happens is that, during the winter, the Zuhr, Asr, Maghrib prayer, they come together. Basically, like within a 3-hour period, you have to read your Zuhr, you have to read your Asr, and you have to read your Maghrib. And during the winter, according to Imam Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, Asr Salah begins when the shadow is twice its length, which is generally around 2:15, 2:20. So the question is that students, like Hanafi students who follow the teachings of Imam Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, if they have a 2-hour lecture from 2 till 4, then at what time should they read the Asr prayer? Should they, for example, combine their prayer? Should they read it during Zuhr time, read Zuhr and Asr together? Or should they do qaza of the prayer, wait until 4 o'clock when it's Maghrib time, and then during Maghrib time read their Asr and read their Maghrib? Now the masla with regards to this particular situation is that in such a situation, in such a scenario, a person would be allowed to act upon the view of Imam Abu Yusuf rahmatullah alayhi and the view of Imam Muhammad rahmatullah alayhi. Now Imam Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, they were the students of Imam Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, and their view with regards to the beginning of Asr is that when the shadow is misli awwal, i.e. it's after the shadow, after the original shadow, if the shadow comes, which is around, generally speaking, the winter around 1:40, 1:45 p.m., then at that time they will be allowed and they will be permitted to read their Asr prayer. So the conclusion of the masla is that if in a situation like you're in colleges or universities and you cannot read your Asr prayer according to the view of Imam Hanif rahmatullah alayhi, then in that situation you'll be allowed to read the Asr prayer when it begins according to the time of Imam Yusuf rahmatullah alayhi and Imam Muhammad rahmatullah alayhi, which generally speaking is around approximately 20, 25, 30 minutes before the normal time according to the masla in the Hanafi fiqh. So that is one masla which I would just like to clarify. Then after that we went on to look at the way azan became prescribed. And I mentioned that one distinctive feature of the way azan became prescribed in comparison to other injunctions of Islam such as like salah and fasting and zakat is that fasting and zakat and hajj, they were prescribed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordering Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam the obligation through Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam. But I mentioned last week, according to the hadith of Musnad Ahmad, Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Sunan ibn Majah, Sunan Abu Dawud, that the way azan became prescribed was through a dream seen by Sayyidina Abdullah bin Zayd bin Abdi Rabi and also by Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radhiyallahu anhu, that they saw a dream, and in the dream they were being told, or they were being informed, that instead of using a bell to call people towards the salah, to call people towards the namaz, instead you should use these words, i.e. Allahu Akbar, all the way until the end. And from this particular dream, that's when the obligation, or if you say the sunnat al-muakkada of azan became prescribed. Now I'll take this opportunity to mention or to talk about some masail with regards to the azan and the iqamah. Now, as all of you know, it is emphasized sunnah, it is sunnat al-muakkada to give azan for all your 5 daily prayers. And in particular, when you are reading salah with congregation, with jamaat, like in the masjid, or even at home if there is a congregation, then to make azan or to do iqamah is considered sunnat al-muakkada. Now, the masla which we're going to look at the next few minutes or so is with regards to if a person is reading salah by himself at home, that does that person or does that individual is still required to give azan or is still required to give the iqamah? Now, with regards to this particular masla, there are two situations. The first situation is that that person, he is living in such an area where there is a masjid nearby, or he is living within the vicinity of a masjid, or like, let's make it even more simpler, basically he's living in an area where there is a masjid and the azan and the iqamah takes place and congregation prayers takes place. Now, if a person, just say for example, like in Small East, is living in Small East where there's many masajid, there's many mosques, and azan and iqamah takes place, you have 5 daily prayers and so on. Then just say for example, Zuhr namaz is reading at home. Then in that situation, the azan of the local mosque is sufficient for him as well. Meaning that if he is reading namaz at home, he doesn't need to give azan. Or it's not sunnat al-muakkada for him to give the azan, and it's not even sunnat al-muakkada for him to give the iqamah. So if a person is reading namaz by himself at home, the scholars, the fuqaha, the jurists have said that it is mustahab, it is desirable to give the azan again and to give the iqamah again. However, if he doesn't and he reads the namaz without giving the azan, without giving the iqamah, then there's nothing wrong with it and there will be no detestability and no karahiyah in his salah. So that is the first situation, and that depends on whether he is living in the vicinity of a masjid or in an area where there is a masjid and a mosque nearby where the azan for all the 5 prayers, the iqamah for all the 5 prayers take place. The second situation is that a person is living in such an area where the azan and the iqamah, or there isn't a masjid, and the azan and the iqamah does not take place. Like for example, just say in King's Eve or Yardley or somewhere Solihull, Sutton Coldfield, where there's hardly any masjid, hardly any Muslims at all, there's hardly any masjid at all. Then in that situation, if he's reading namaz at home by himself, then it is sunnat al-muakkada, it is the emphasized sunnah that he gives the azan, and on top of that it is also a sunnat al-muakkada, it is also an emphasized sunnah that he gives the iqamah as well before he reads namaz. Even though he may be reading namaz by himself, even though there may be no one following him behind, but even then it is still sunnat al-muakkada, it is still an emphasized sunnah to give the azan and to give the iqamah before you start your prayer. So that is the second situation, where there isn't a masjid in his local area, when there isn't a masjid nearby. So that is the first situation, the first masla. The second masla, which stems from here, is that sometimes a person, he comes to the masjid, and let's say for example, like Zuhr namaz is at 2 o'clock, the Jamaat, the congregation, and normally in that mosque they give the azan at 1:40. So 20 minutes before they give the azan, and then at 2 o'clock they lead the prayer. But this person, he's come to the mosque at 1:20. Zuhr namaz has started, but he's in a rush. He has to go somewhere. He's got appointments and so on. So what does he do in that situation? Like he's come to the mosque, the azan hasn't taken place yet, the iqama hasn't taken place yet, the congregation hasn't taken place yet. He's, just for example, he's come to this mosque and in the hall adjacent, he just wants to read namaz quickly by himself and he has to go. So in that situation, what should he do? So again, the masla and the ruling written by the Hanafi jurist is that it is still sunnat muakkada, it is still an emphasized sunnah to give the azan and to give the iqama. Even though you're reading by yourself, even though you're in the masjid, but because the azan for that particular salah or for that particular namaz hasn't taken place, in that situation you are still required to give the azan and you are still required to give the iqama and then you start your namaz. Obviously the azan, you won't make it loud. Obviously, you won't go to the scanner or go to the mic and give the azan loudly. What will you do? Just like normally, you'll just say by yourself, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. It doesn't have to be like a very loud voice or anything like that. As long as you can hear, then that will be sufficient. So the second masla is that even if you come to the mosque, the azan and the iqama for that particular namaz hasn't taken place yet, and you have to read the namaz by yourself quickly because you've got an appointment or you have to go somewhere, then in that situation it is still sunnat muakkada and you are still required to give the azan and to give the iqama before you start your namaz. The third masla with regards to the azan and the iqama is that sometimes you may be in the masjid and you hear the azan. So what is the ruling? Are you allowed to leave the masjid without reading the salah, or would you be able or would you be permitted to leave the masjid without performing the salah? Just for example, like at Zuhr time, you were shopping on Coventry Road and you came through the masjid at 1:20, the azan has taken place. So the question or the issue is that whether you will be allowed to leave the masjid after hearing the azan, would you be allowed to leave the masjid without performing your Zuhr salah? Now the masla or the ruling in the Hanafi fiqh is that it is makruh tahrimi to leave the masjid after you've heard the azan without reading that prescribed salah, without reading that prescribed namaz. You were in the masjid, the Zuhr azan takes place. Then for you to leave the masjid without performing that Zuhr namaz, without performing the Asr namaz, or without performing that particular namaz, is considered as makruh tahrimi, is considered as severely disliked. However, if there is an excuse or if there is a uzr, then one will be allowed and one will be permitted to leave the masjid without reading that particular salah. Now what are the excuses? Excuses written by Mufti Taqi Usmani in his Dars al-Tirmizi, which is a commentary of Sunan al-Tirmizi, is like, for example, just say if a person happens to be an imam of another masjid. Now, for example, he was, just say at 1:20 when the azan for Zuhr takes place for this mosque, so he happens to be here. But however, he's an imam of another masjid and their Jamaat is at 2 o'clock. So in that situation, because he's like an imam of another masjid and he has to go there and lead the prayer, so therefore, even though he's heard the azan here, it's not compulsory for him, or it's not necessary for him to stay in this masjid, read the Zuhr salah, read the Zuhr here, and then go to his mosque. In that situation, he will be allowed and it will be permissible for him to leave the masjid and go to the other mosque and lead that prayer. So that is the first excuse or the first uzr, is that if he happens to be an imam of another masjid. The second uzr or the second excuse is that if he has already read his salah. Azan takes place for a particular salah like Zuhr and Asr, but he's already read it somewhere. Earlier on, like 15-20 minutes earlier, at home, just say, or whether in the masjid, in another mosque, he read his salah. Then in that situation, when he hears the azan for another masjid, then he will be allowed to leave that mosque without reading that particular salah or without reading that respective salah. Why? Because he's already read that particular salah from before. So that is the second uzr and the second excuse. The third uzr or the third excuse is that if something has happened, an emergency has happened. He was in the masjid, he heard the azan at 1:20 and he was reading his sunnah and so on. and then he was waiting for the Zuhr congregation to read it, and then he gets a call from home that something has happened to his parents or something has happened to his children and so on, so he has to quickly rush back. Then in that situation, because an emergency or something important or something has happened, then in that situation he will be allowed to leave the masjid, he will be allowed to leave the mosque, and without, even though he's heard the azan, without reading that prescribed namaz. Why? Because an emergency or something has happened to his family or to his parents or to his relatives. So in that situation, he will be allowed to leave without reading that prescribed namaz. And the fourth situation, or the fourth occasion where a person would be allowed to leave the masjid after hearing the azan without reading that prescribed namaz, is that if he has the intention of reaching another mosque or reading salah at another mosque. For example, he may have been shopping on Coventry Road, so he comes to the masjid at 1:20, the Zuhr azan takes place. So he thinks to himself that, look, there's 20 minutes left before the congregation salah. If I go to another masjid which is around 3-4 minutes away from here, I could still get there. I could read my sunnahs. I could, read my I could read salah with congregation and so on. So if he is done with that intention, then it will be permissible. So the four excuses, very quickly, where he will be allowed to leave the masjid even though he's already heard the azan, is number one is that if he happens to be the imam of another mosque. Number two, if he has already read his salah. Number three, if an emergency has occurred, if an emergency has happened. And number four is that if he has an intention or if he has a hope or i'timad that he will be able to go to another mosque nearby and read the salah and read the congregation or read the namaz with that particular congregation. So that is the first batch of masail with regards to the azan. The next thing which we're going to look at, which also linked with the azan, is something called al-ijaba in Arabic, which basically means that when you hear the words of the azan, to repeat or to say the words of the azan, that is known as al-ijaba. And the masla and the ruling is that whoever hears the azan, whether it's a male or female, it is mustahab and desirable to reply to the words of the azan. And it is mentioned in a hadith of Sahih al-Muslim and Sunnah Abu Dawud, where the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that whoever repeats the words of the muazzin with conviction, with iman, and with the intention of reward, iman and wa ihtisaban, meaning that if a person, the muazzin, he is reciting the words of the azan, and a person, he hears the words of the azan and he repeats the words of the azan with conviction, with the intention of reward, then it comes in the hadith that that person will enter Jannah. That person will enter paradise, dakhal al-Jannah, that person will enter paradise. So from this we can understand that when the azan is taking place, then obviously if it's possible, it's mustahab that you reply to the words of the azan. Now, one masla here before we look at the main masla. The first masla is that you only reply to the azan if the azan happens to be live, meaning that it is being done in reality and it is done live. So for example, like when you hear the azan on the scanner, so obviously because the azan is being done live, so therefore it is mustahab and desirable to repeat the words of the azan. You're in the masjid, the muazzin is saying the azan, so because the azan is being done live, so therefore it is mustahab and desirable to reply to the azan. If the azan is pre-recorded, and like many television channels nowadays, like Islam channel and so on, they tend to pre-record the azan. So if the azan is pre-recorded, then it is not desirable. It is not mustahab to repeat the words of the azan. You know, on Islam channel or Bangla TV or Channel S, whatever, so when they like do the azan for Asr and Isha and Maghrib and so on, most of the time it's pre-recorded. So if it's pre-recorded, so therefore it is not mustahab, it is not desirable for you to repeat the words of the azan. You can if you want to do it, then there's no like prohibition or anything like that, but it is not desirable or it's not considered like an act of reward if you were to repeat the words of the azan. Why? Because they are pre-recorded. However, if you are sure, or if you know for sure or certain that the azan which is being broadcasted on the television, on the radio, is actually live. Like, for example, during the Ramadan season or during the Hajj season, the various television channels, they tend to broadcast live from Mecca and from Medina and all these places. So if you know that the azan is live, then it is mustahab, then it is desirable to reply to the words of the azan. But I said during the year or throughout the year, most of the time the azan is pre-recorded. That when the particular time comes and they just give the azan. So because it's pre-recorded, so therefore it is only mustahab and it is desirable to, it's not mustahab, sorry, and it is not desirable to reply to the words of the azan. And the same ruling also applies for radio as well, like Unity FM and other Islamic kind of radio stations, because again during the azan which they give for the various namazes, it is pre-recorded, so therefore it is not desirable and it is not mustahab to reply to the words of the azan. Now, after a person has heard the words of the azan, then it is mentioned in a hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari that a person, he should make a dua. And the dua is that a person should say, Allahumma rabba hazi da'wa salati al-qa'ima ati Muhammadin wasilata wal-fazila wa ba'athu maqama mahmudan alladhi wa'atta. Now, just a few masail with regards to this particular dua. The first masala is that according to the majority of the narrations and the main text of Sahih al-Bukhari, the dua finishes until wa'atta. There isn't innaka la tukhliful mi'ad. It's only in a few narrations or a very few hadiths where it's got the extra innaka la tukhliful mi'ad. So therefore, generally speaking, you should just read the dua all the way until wa'atta. However, if a person, without deeming it to be sunnah, without deeming it to be necessary, reads the extra innaka la tukhliful mi'ad, then that would be considered permissible and that would be considered halal. And similarly, in the dua, sometimes you hear people add other words as well, like darajat al-rafiya and so on. So those kind of words are not established in the hadith at all. It's not mentioned in the hadith, such as darajat al-rafiya and so on. So therefore, one should refrain from saying that particular fragment or that particular phrase when coming to say the dua for the azan. However, if a person, if he wants to do it for his own benefit or out of love of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then there's nothing wrong with it, as long as he does not deem it to be a sunnah, as long as he does not deem it to be one of the parts or the essential part of the dua, or as long as he does not deem it to be this is the words which have been narrated from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that is the first ruling, and that is that the dua, preferably it should be done all the way until wa'atta, and then innaka la tukhliful mi'ad, you can read it, or other extra words like darajat al-rafiya, you can read it as long as you do not deem it to be necessary or do not deem it to be the words or part of that particular dua. The next ruling with regards to the dua is that whether a person is required to raise his hand when he does this particular dua. That when after the azan has taken place, then should you raise your hand and read this particular dua, Allahumma rabba hazi da'wati tamma, and so on and so forth. Now, to understand this particular ruling and masla, firstly I'll just mention a principle written by Mufti Rashid Ahmed Ludhiani in his Ahsan al-Fatawa. Now, Mufti Rashid Ahmed in his Ahsan al-Fatawa has written that there are two types of dua. The first type of duas, or the first type of supplication, are those duas, are those supplications where the words have been transmitted by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the words have been mentioned in the Holy Quran. And at the same time, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has informed us when to read that particular dua. So that is like the first category of dua, or the first types of dua, where the words have been narrated or have been related from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and at the same time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has told us when to read this particular dua. So I'll give you an example, like the dua before you go to the toilet. So that is mentioned in a hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-khubusi wal khaba'is, that before you enter the toilet, then you should read this particular dua where you seek refuge from the male devils, from the male shaitans, and from the female shaitans. Similarly, after exiting the toilet, there is also a hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari where the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would read Ghufranak alhamdulillahi allazi azhaba anni al-adha wa afan. The duas before eating, Bismillah wa la barakatillah, that is also mentioned in a hadith. The dua after finishing eating, that is also mentioned in the hadith. So the first category or the first type of duas are those duas which have been transmitted from hadith, from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and at the same time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has told us that read this dua before this, or read this dua after you do this, or read this dua during when you do this. Now, with regards to the first category of duas, where the words have been transmitted from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the occasion and the time when to read this dua has also been narrated by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One is not required to raise his hand. One is not required to raise his hand. So therefore, like when we go to the toilet, no one, like before entering the toilet, no one raises his hand and says, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-khubuthi wal khaba'ith. Similarly, when we are leaving the toilet, when we are exiting the toilet, no one raises his hand and says, Ghufranak alhamdulillahi allazi azhaba anni al-adha wa afani. We just read it by ourselves, and then we go to the wuzu, we do wuzu, and then we come upstairs and read salah and so on. So that is the first principle, where the du'as have been transmitted from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The occasions and the time when you should read this dua has also been said by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In that situation, you are not required to raise your hand. Then the second type, or the second category of du'as, are those supplications where the word has been transmitted from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the words are mentioned in the Holy Quran. However, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't tell us or didn't say that you have to read this dua after this time. So the second types of duas are those duas where the words have been mentioned in the hadith, where the words are mentioned in the Holy Quran. However, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't inform us or didn't tell us that you should read this dua at this particular time. An example of that will be like the dua which we read after the salah, after each namaz. That we'll say, Allahumma atina fi dunya hasana wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina azaban nar, and Rabbana zalamna anfusana, and so on. So obviously these duas are mentioned in hadith, and they are also mentioned in the Quran as well. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't tell us that you should read this dua after the first namaz. Now you could read this dua whenever. If you want, you could read it after first namaz, after nafil namaz, or even now, like after the dars we may do a dua, then obviously to read that dua and so on. You can do it whenever. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam hasn't specified the time and the occasion to read that particular dua. Now with regards to the second category of duas, the masla and the ruling is that it is mustahab and it is desirable to raise your hand when doing those kind of duas. Like after the namaz, where the duas, the words have been transmitted. However, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam hasn't told us to read it after the fard namaz. So those kind of duas you will be allowed, or it is mustahab and desirable to raise your hands and then read that particular dua. Now, with regards to the dua of the azan, we can see that the dua for the azan falls in the first category, where the word has been transmitted from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As I mentioned, the hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that after you hear the words of the azan, then read this dua. So the words have been transmitted by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and at the same time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has told us, has informed us when we should read this dua. That we should read this dua after we've heard the azan. So because the words of the azan, they fall in the first category, so therefore it is not mustahab and it is not desirable to raise your hand whilst reading that particular dua. So when you heard the azan, then you shouldn't raise your hands and read the dua, Allahumma rabba haz da'wati tama. Instead you should keep your hands down and then read your dua as you would normally do before you eat. You don't raise your hands and say Bismillah wa la barakatillah, or after you finish eating you don't raise your hands and then you read the dua, or before you're drinking water you don't raise your hands and read the dua, before you get intimate with your wife you don't raise your hands and read the dua, and so on. So exactly same situations here as well, that because the words have been transmitted from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the occasion has also been told by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In that situation, it is not mustahab and it is not desirable to raise your hand to recite this particular dua. Now, one final mas'ala with regards to, before we conclude the azan section, is, again, because of these are like contemporary issues due to the community, due to the area we live in, that people, they ask these kind of questions, they pose these kind of questions, and they're not sure what do the Hanafi scholars or what is the view with regards to this particular mas'ala from the Hanafi point or from the Hanafi viewpoint. And the mas'ala which we're going to look at very briefly is with regards to kissing your thumbs at the time of azan and then wiping it over your eyes. That when the phrase in the azan, Ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah, is being recited, then some people, they will kiss their thumbs and then they will wipe it over their eyes. So what does Islam say, or what do the Hanafi scholars say with regards to this particular mas'ala? Now, it is mentioned in a hadith of Sunan al-Daylami, in where it's mentioned that Sayyidina Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu, like it's actually related by Sayyidina Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu, that when Sayyidina Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu heard the muazzin say, Ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah, then Sayyidina Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu would lift his fingers, he would kiss his index finger, and in some narration it says that he would kiss his thumb, and then he would wipe it over his eyes. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw what Sayyidina Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu did, and he said that whoever does what my friend has just done, wajabat shafa'ati alayhi, my intercession will be wajib and obligatory upon that person. So the hadith of Sunan Daylami, the conclusion of this particular hadith is that this hadith is saying, or Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying, that if a person was to kiss his thumbs at the time of azan or his index finger and then wipe it over his eyes, then it is such a great act, or it's such a rewardable act, that on the day of judgment, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself would intercede for that particular person. Now, this particular hadith of Sunan al-Daylami is a weak hadith, and as I mentioned, in particular on the Laylatul Bara'ah talk, that weak hadiths can be used for acts of virtues. That for Fadail, where there's acts of virtues like virtues of Sha'ban, virtues of Ramadan, virtues of coming to the masjid early, virtues of reading Salah in congregation, you can use weak hadiths. However, you cannot use weak hadiths to establish a legal ruling. That to establish a masla or something permissible or something impermissible, then you cannot use a weak hadith. So because of this, Mufti Taqi Usmani in his contemporary fatwas has written that if a person, when he was hearing the azan, out of love of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, out of respect of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he kisses his thumb or he kisses his index finger and then he wipes it over his eyes, then there is nothing wrong with it. That it is permissible as long as he's doing it with the love of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with out of honor and respect of Rasulullah sallallahu